Thank you so much for the introduction, Jonathan, and for the invitation to speak at Web Accessibility in Mind conference, the first one. Fantastic. I have long been a fan of Web Accessibility in Mind. I've learned so much from you as a group. So it's an absolute delight to be with you all here today, although I'm slightly disappointed that I can't go to Regine's talk on inclusion and accessibility in XR because that looks fantastic. So my name is Henny Swan. You can find me on Twitter as @ihenny, IHENI. I am an accessibility hobo. That's how I describe myself. I've been working in this area for over 20 years now. Currently, I work at a company called Tetralogical. We are a very small UK-based accessibility consultancy, and we do all things accessibility and inclusion across web, mobile, XR, AR, biometrics, all sorts of really interesting things like that. So I'm going to talk to you today about designing for people who use a mouse. And you might be asking yourselves, why am I talking about designing for mouse users when typically people with disabilities don't use a mouse or may not use a mouse all the time? So what happened is we're about to publish a series of blog posts called Designing For, where we talk about the challenges that people experience when browsing with a screen reader or with a keyboard or with screen magnification. And we're doing the Designing For series targeted at designers so they consider different types of people and the challenges they experience when they're using different types of assistive technology and have different types of disability. And it struck me that we are always talking about these various different pieces of AT, assistive technology, but we very rarely talk about people who are browsing with a mouse. We tend to think of the web as being mouse friendly. It's the default experience, if you will. And maybe because we assume people who use a mouse are not disabled, we don't always consciously design with mouse users in mind, and specifically mouse users with disabilities in mind. We tend to design, code, and test websites with keyboard users in mind. We think of people being either a mouse or a keyboard user with an assumption, and it is an assumption, that a mouse user is not disabled and a keyboard user is disabled. It becomes very kind of black and white and quite binary. It's a convenient generalization that helps us frame disability and accessibility, and perhaps a generalization that we need as a starting point for the conversation around accessibility. However, I would argue that it's not necessarily reality. Most of us, including some people with physical disabilities, have the potential to be a mouse user. I would also say that a keyboard-only user is rare. It's very difficult to find somebody who is only a keyboard user. People who use a keyboard predominantly tend to also use a mouse or another input device, such as a head switch or voice or other assistive technology. So people use a combination of different things. And actually, when it comes to user research with people with disabilities and testing our digital products with people with disabilities, quite often clients will ask us to include two people who are keyboard-only users, and I quote, keyboard-only users. But in my experience, it's very, very difficult to find anybody who is such a kind of user. You might find somebody who predominantly uses a keyboard, but finding someone who only uses a keyboard is very, very rare. So let's look at the 4 disability groups and think about who may or may not be using a mouse. So by the 4 disability groups, we have physical, vision, hearing, and cognition. Looking at physical for a moment, this is the group that we tend to assume do not use a mouse. So it might be people who have tremors in their hands, people with a form of paralysis, so they can't move their upper body potentially, maybe not be able to move their arms, people with missing limbs, or then people with a temporary disability like a broken finger or cold hands. This doesn't cover everybody, but it gives you a broad sort of idea of the different types of people. But even within this group, there may well be people who are mouse users. They might not be predominantly mouse users, but they may use a mouse for certain tasks. And all of a sudden that escalates the importance of getting our designs right for people who use a mouse. And then when we look at the other three groups, vision, hearing, cognition, vision, we have people who are blind. We have people who won't be using a mouse potentially if they've got no useful sight. People with low vision who may be using screen magnification and will potentially be using a mouse. People who are colorblind who might use a mouse. People who are tired or in bright sunlight who are mouse users. People who are hearing impaired or disabled, people who are deaf, hearing impaired, have auditory processing issues, so trouble understanding what they hear, tinnitus or in loud places. We don't typically think of them as being keyboard only users. They are mouse users as well. And they may also have other types of disability, as may any person with a disability. You might have a combination of. And then people with cognition and learning disability, so people on the autistic spectrum, learning disabilities such as dyslexia or processing, memory, anxiety, being in a rush, all of these people will be using a mouse. So I would say that with the exception of somebody who is fully blind and fully reliant on a screen reader, or somebody with an extreme physical impairment, with the exception of perhaps those groups of people, everybody, almost everyone, could be a mouse user. And it may not be all of us, but arguably mouse users are the largest group of people on the web, which cover both disabled and non-disabled people. We also tend to think that people with degenerative diseases start from a place of using a mouse, and because of their degenerative illness, end up at a place of being forced to use a keyboard or another input device. And I think that's another myth within accessibility. James Williamson is an author and developer with ALS. You may remember the Ice Bucket Challenge a few years ago, which raised money for people with ALS, also known as locked-in syndrome. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis is when your muscles slowly stop to work and your voice slowly stops to work, hence it being called locked-in syndrome. And James had written a series of really quite phenomenally insightful blog posts around his condition and how he experiences the web. And in his post, What I've Learned About Motor Impairment, he says this: I found that as my impairment has progressed, I use my keyboard less and less frequently. My primary means of interacting with the web is by using my mouse, over which I still have a fair amount of control, and through voice diction software. So he completely debunks the myth that everybody who is disabled is going to be using a keyboard. And in his the rest of his post, he talks about how he uses a mouse for certain types of task, and perhaps a keyboard for other types of task, and voice diction software for other types of task. The other thing that's interesting to think about or important to consider is his condition is changing. So the types of assistive technology that he will be more reliant on may change over time. So again, we're not all fixed, we are all individual. So this brings us to considering people's situation. So consider situation is one of the inclusive design principles. And it's a principle that I always think about being one that is very much bringing us back to thinking about people and how and when and what they're using when they're accessing your content online. So the principle for consider situation is people use your interface in different situations. Make sure your interface delivers a valuable experience to people regardless of their circumstances. So think about keyboard usage and mouse usage for all different types of disability: vision, physical, hearing, cognition, and learning. So thinking about the who is where we start, and where we need to be who we need to be thinking about throughout the whole design process, but we need to be thinking about the what. So what is it that mouse users typically do when you interact with content? Well, you can click, you can point, you can drag, you can scroll, you can hover. All of these actions need two things: dexterity and useful vision. Fine motor skills, still hands, ability to see the mouse and content, but hold that thought. Dexterity and useful vision is needed to complete all of those actions. I want to look at a few of the design challenges that I've been digging around out there on the internet, and I want to do that against the backdrop of the inclusive design principles and the web content accessibility guidelines. Thinking about how the web content accessibility guidelines is very much focused on implementation of accessibility, and arguably slightly more focused on technical implementation of accessibility, and where the inclusive design principles are much more pulling us back into experience and thinking about people and how they experience your content. So, visible hover states. As a mouse user, or as a mouse user and keyboard user, I want to be able to see my mouse and where the focus is so that I can interact with content. As a mouse user or a mouse and keyboard user, I want to understand what is interactive and what is not interactive on a page. And as a mouse-only user or a mouse and keyboard user, I want to have, or rather as a mouse and keyboard user, I want to have a consistent experience when using both keyboard and mouse. So thinking about those scenarios, well, let's look at a couple of examples. Just as visible focus states are important for keyboard users, visible hover states are as important for mouse users. Now, built into the browser, to the platform, as a mouse user, when you hover over some content, you get the wavy hand. So arguably, technically, that is accessible because there is a visual change. However, it's not in real life particularly obvious. The browser default hover state of the hand is easy to lose and easy to miss entirely. It's quite similar to the scenario of using the browser default for the focus state when using a keyboard, where the green or the blue focus outline, depending on your browser, can become lost if the element you are focused on is a similar color or the same color to the focus outline. So in this example, I've got two focusable elements, and when I try and navigate between them, I'm just moving my mouse between two focusable elements, which are a map and some text. I get the wavy hand, but I get no visible change of focus state, which when I first used this website, I completely missed. And that would become really, really problematic for someone who's got low vision, who may struggle to see these things, or someone who's just not familiar with the web and or familiar with the web when there are no styles. Oh, freeze. Another one is here we've got a website where we've got it's a festival website actually, where we've got presented in part by on the page, and then we've got three names of bands. We've got Labyrinth, Front Left, Green Mountain, and then underneath, thank you to our sponsors, Snug. When we look at this, it looks like, from a sighted user's perspective, like three pieces of text. It doesn't look interactive. There's no visual cue that these are linked or not. And when I hover over them, again, I get the wavy hand. But when I, sorry, for some reason the videos aren't working. Okay, there we go. So when I tab through these, I get the green focus outline on two of the three things in the top row, and then a link underneath. And then when I mouse over them, I just get the mouse wavy hand. So I've got an inconsistent experience for somebody who's using both mouse and keyboard, which can be confusing. A more dramatic example is here, where we have a website with a main navigation at the top. And when I start tabbing through the page, the visible focus outline is shown. Apologies. So when I start tabbing through the page, I get the green focus outline. But when I start using my mouse, I then get, and I put the mouse over one of the main navigation links, I get this big drop down mega menu, which gives me lots of options of where else to go. So I get an entirely different experience, which cognitively can be really confusing for people. So be consistent, use familiar conventions and apply them consistently. Other things that we need to think about when it comes to hover is provide good contrast for hover states and focus states, add additional styles as well as color to changes. And probably my biggest annoyance is provide a consistent style for both mouse hover and keyboard focus. That's probably the key point here, because then you feel that you are included and you are expected. Next, we have touch target size. So as a mouse user, I want buttons, links and controls to be big enough so that I can select them with a mouse. Now, this is actually a WCAG AAA requirement to provide a sufficient touch target size of 44 by 44 pixels. However, it's a AAA requirement. So level AA is really the accepted standard of compliance that all laws, governments, companies, and websites try and achieve in order to be accessible. AAA are success criteria that you do if you can meet them. And I think touch target size is a really, really important one for people who are using a mouse, because if you can't accurately hold your mouse over something and select it, you can get thrown off into a different direction, or you can open modal dialogues and it can become very confusing. So on screen, I have a scheduling. It's laid out like a calendar. So you've got days in columns and you've got people in rows. And for each of those days, for each of those individuals, you have a number of events on each day. Each of those events is a button, and each of those button, the sizes depend on the length of time of an event. So if, for example, you've got a meeting for 3 hours, you're going to have a fairly big touch target size. But if you've got a meeting for half an hour, then you're going to have a very small touch target size, making it harder to access. If you've got a day where you've got several very short meetings back to back, you then have a number of links which are all squished together, and it becomes increasingly difficult to accurately get your mouse to interact with that button. The same issue happens when you go to mobile as well. All our fingers are a certain size. We can't make them smaller if we want to. They are what they are. And touching those smaller events when you've got a tiny little area and they're all squished up together becomes very, very difficult. But when it comes to the touch target size, think about the type of content that you're creating. If you've got very popular content or frequently used or important content, then you really want to be increasing the touch target size so that people can comfortably interact with it. This is a video created by James Williamson, which is of his favorite website, festival website. It's a main navigation in a horizontal row, and it has festival info. And he's trying to access the links that appear underneath it. But the links that appear in a row underneath it are in a very, very narrow horizontal space. And it's incredibly difficult for him to select the festival info link, move down a fraction, and then move accurately along the link. So give control. Ensure people are in control. People should be able to access and interact their content in their preferred ways. So use that minimum touch target size of 44 times 44 pixels. minimum is emphasized because that's the minimum it should be. That doesn't mean that that's kind of the highest you want to make it. You should be comfortably exceeding that if you can. Provide space between interactive controls so that people have an opportunity to accurately target what they need to target. And use a larger target size for things or controls that are used frequently or are difficult to reach, for example, at the side of a page. A very difficult interaction for mouse users is when you need to go to the side of the browser and scroll, and trying to accurately get your mouse over the scroll bar is very, very difficult. Or perhaps if the control is part of a sequential task or it's something that's not easily undone. This helps so many different people who use mobile devices, people who have tremors in their hands, people who are traveling on bumpy trains, perhaps commuting in and out of work, people who are holding devices in one hand, people with large hands or larger fingers. All of those people will benefit. Content on hover. So as a mouse user, I want to be able to reach content on hover. As a mouse user, I do not want to be distracted or disorientated by content that I don't want on hover. And I don't want priority content, core content, to be put within a hover interaction. So let's unpack these a little bit. Fine motor skills are needed to access content on hover. Some content on hover may look big enough to access it. So we've got an example up on screen here where we've got an avatar, which is a small round circle, but big enough to target with your mouse. And it opens up a large box on hover with an image of the avatar, a name, some information, a link, and a button. That's lovely. It's lovely and big. But the fine motor skills needed when you hover over the avatar and the hover content appears, and when you move the mouse to try and get into the box, it disappears because you have to move up through the avatar to the downward pointing arrow that connects the box to the avatar. And that is a really, really tricky interaction. Timing is also an issue as well. So when you have a hover on content appear like this, and if you don't manage to get your mouse there in time, it just disappears. You've got no opportunity to get there. That's something that completely can stop you in your path. So you shouldn't be putting priority content there. So we've got wanted content on hover, but then we've got unwanted content on hover. So content that we don't want, but we know is there, but content that we don't want, but we don't know is there, but you might inadvertently access on hover by mistake. So in this short clip, we have a mouse user who is also a screen magnification user. Everything on screen is magnified up to sort of 200, 400%. And what you get on screen when you open up a page is effectively the advertising at the top. And then you have the page content that follows after the main navigation. Advertising and unwanted content on hover are not friends with each other. Advertising is here to stay. We need to do it in a much better way and make sure it's more accessible. But in this scenario, we have the screen enlarged for the screen magnification user, mousing around the screen. It's a TV show website. So we go down to a TV show. It's called Breaking the Law, Bent Coppers. Yep, we're going to watch that. So we select it. The page opens. We see a little bit of the main navigation. We see the heading of the show. So I know that we're on the right page. And then suddenly there is an animation that appears of a dinosaur with Lincoln popping out of its nostrils. That confused me because I was expecting a video. So inadvertently, the mouse has moved over the advert, which has pushed the main content down the page. And because we're magnified so far, it's completely disorientated me. So consider mouse users and people with screen magnification as well. So this can be tied back to the inclusive design principle of prioritized content. Help users focus on core tasks, features, and information by prioritizing them within the content and layout. So never use hover for priority content, including links and buttons, things like that. If you do, then make sure that you provide that content elsewhere within the page in a way that's easy to discover. Burying it somewhere else or on a different page is not really going to be a suitable alternative. Do not obscure priority content with unwanted content on hover. It's confusing, it's disorientating. Ensure hover content is also available through other means, as I've just said, and ensure the target of the content is easy to reach and it stays on screen long enough that you can access it. So again, this helps people with screen magnification, it helps people with tremors or dexterity issues. I do think this helps people who wouldn't identify as having any sight issues or dexterity issues as well. A lot of these interactions are tricky for many people to do. Next, we have that old favorite of drag and drop. As a mouse user, I want to be able to move content without holding down the mouse and causing pain in my hand. And I want to be able to move content without having to scroll long distances as well. Drag and drop is the poster child of a bad interaction for people who use a keyboard, but actually it's also the poster child of a bad interaction for people who use a mouse. It's incredibly difficult to use. I think one area in particular that is a challenge is drag, drop, and scroll. So drag and drop requires the user to both hold down a mouse and to drag the mouse at the same time. So that's two things that you're having to do with your hand, two very difficult interactions. If the distance you have to drag is far, it becomes even more difficult. If you think about people on a trackpad where you only have a certain amount of area to move, sometimes it means you can't move to any far distance because you get to the end of your trackpad. So it becomes really, really difficult. So in this file sharing interface, we have a file at the bottom of the page that needs to be moved into a subfolder that happens to be off screen at the top of the page. So to do this, we have to click, hold, drag and scroll. So here I am scrolling up to or dragging up to the top, and it won't scroll the page up any further. So I have to move back down, go and see if the file's there. And it just doesn't work for me. It becomes really, really difficult. So the way to get around this is to provide an alternative way to access this interaction. So we know that we need to provide a keyboard alternative for drag and drop. Doesn't matter how accessible you can make your drag and drop to people who use a screen reader and a keyboard, we do still need to have an alternative for drag or drop because mouse users typically can have a very big struggle when using it. So provide a mechanism to complete the same action using both a mouse and keyboard. So here we have a control to the right of the file that we are trying to move that opens up a menu. You can click move, you can then move your mouse to the dialog, you can then scroll and find the folder that you want to move the item to, select it, and then select move. Fully mouse and keyboard accessible, much easier, and it helps you bypass that awful scrolling situation. So offer choice. Consider providing different ways for people to complete tasks, especially those that are complex and non-standard. So provide alternatives. We are great at providing alternatives for keyboard users, but provide alternatives that mouse users can also use. This helps people with RSI, tremors, helps people with dexterity issues who might be younger, with less developed and smaller hands, or people who are older, who may also be struggling with eyesight issues as well. Next up, we have scroll, and scroll is surprisingly difficult for many, many people. So as a mouse user, I want to be able to browse content without scrolling. Now, you could be a mouse user who is also sensitive to movement, who has vestibular disorders, who perhaps has migraines, who struggles with animation. So perhaps you are on the autistic spectrum and lots of movement becomes particularly problematic. So as a mouse user with those types of disability, scrolling becomes really problematic. So I'm looking at the same file sharing interface. Now I'm into a folder which has got lots and lots and lots and lots of different files in it. And I want to be able to browse everything, but I don't want to scroll. So I did some user research a few years ago with, there was a lady who had Asperger's, and she was on mobile and she was looking at a page of listings for TV programs, and she would not scroll. She would only look at the content that was there on screen. So it became clear to us that it was really important that we found different ways for people like her to get as much on screen as possible. So this file sharing interface has done exactly that. They provide different options. So here we have a regular list, which just lists everything in relatively small print, but then you can move that and you can change that into a large list, which makes the target area, the touch target area around each of those links larger, which will accommodate people who need a slightly larger target area, who perhaps have shaky hands or tremors. You can then choose to have a grid option, which gives you a larger touch target area. The grid option shows images. This is a folder with lots of images in. So rather than just having the text, it shows you the actual images. So this helps people with cognition or learning disabilities, people who are more comfortable looking for and browsing images. But again, we have larger images. So people who are comfortable with scrolling, but might want an even larger image so that they can see it and accurately get their mouse onto it. So literally by including different grid and list layout options, by including that small feature, we start to accommodate people with sight loss, people with issues with dexterity, cognition, people who are mouse and keyboard users, and people who are not able to scroll and people who are able to scroll. If you think about the smaller list option, when it comes to sight loss, you might have people who have tunnel vision, and actually their preference is to have as much on screen as possible. So this accommodates many different types of people. Another easy fix for pages where there is a lot of scrolling is simply to introduce filters. So if these are listing pages, it works really well. So search results or listings for, as we have on this site, food, so recipes. So did a search for chicken, 1,832 results, which is what you'd expect for a recipe website, quite a lot. But you can filter these so that people do not have to go through and scroll and have to deal with that movement on screen. So again, it's important to offer choice. Consider providing different ways for people to complete tasks, especially those that are complex or non-standard. So always provide an alternative to complete a task. Make sure that that alternative is both keyboard and mouse friendly. And consider providing different layout options, filters, grids, lists, sort bys, all sorts of things like this. This helps people who are on the spectrum, autistic spectrum, and are not comfortable with scrolling, people with dexterity issues who find scrolling difficult or painful, or people who are photosensitive or have issues with movement, where scrolling can have a very negative effect. So there you go. Designing for mouse users is, in fact, designing for everybody. It's design for all. Many people with a disability will be using a mouse, including people who have a physical impairment. And And some people may use a mouse and a keyboard. They might use it for different tasks. They might use it on different websites, or they might use it dependent on whether they're typing something or whether they're searching for something. And consider all disability groups when you are designing mouse interactions. So ask yourself, how would somebody with low vision experience this? How would somebody with cognition or learning impairments, difficulties experience this? Can somebody with a physical disability who may be using a mouse comfortably use this as well? Thank you, and questions?
Thank you so much, Henny. I love that. That was amazing. I do have a few questions. One I tried to answer, and I just want to make sure I gave the correct answer. Right at the start, there's a question if you could share the blog series Designing For. If that's the browsing with series that you did, then I did provide a link to the kind of, I think the last post that had videos and links to the separate blog posts. Is that, if that's not the right post?
No, so the browsing with assistive technology series was the first series, which is where we how people use their assistive technologies. The Designing For series is a follow-up series, which it's not published yet, but this will be really much more focused on design. So things that perhaps sit outside of WCAG, perhaps sit within WCAG, but much more around the user experience for people, and things that you as a visual designer, and as a visual designer, you are also a non-visual designer, if you as an interaction designer or perhaps as a UX writer might need to be thinking about, so that you can accommodate different people. So that will be we'll be starting to publish that quite soon.
Great. Okay. Next question. What statistics exist telling us of the use of mouse with Android or Apple? And then it does say kind of toward the end, if you can tell some anecdotal information on that topic. So mouse on, I guess, mobile.
I don't know that there are statistics, because I don't know how you could gather that, to be honest. I also have a very standard answer when it comes to statistics, which is if it's one person and it's worth doing. So it's important. But mouse users, you don't typically hook up a mouse to a mobile interface. You could hook up a Bluetooth keyboard, an external keyboard, which gives you some support for navigating with a keyboard. But no, I wouldn't have any statistics for you.
Okay, excellent. So another question, if most users are not keyboard-only users, why is there a major emphasis on put on making sure content can be completely navigated by keyboard?
It's not most users are not, it's keyboard-only users, in my experience, will very often be using another alternative input device. That input device, whether it be your voice, so using speech recognition, for example, or a switch device. So you might have a switch by your head and you're navigating by doing this, or you have a sit puff device. It still interacts with content in the same way that under the bonnet within the coding, in the same way that a keyboard user would. So it's a little bit of a catch-all. Kind of keyboard is a bit of a catch-all for alternative input device as well as keyboard as well. My point is that there are people who might be more reliant on a keyboard, but may also defer to using a mouse as well. I think the key takeaway here is that we don't all comfortably sit in kind of walled gardens of disability and use kind of one certain piece of assistive technology when we're interacting with the web. We change. James Williamson talks about how his disability changes and how he uses different things for different tasks, and that's the key takeaway there.
Great. Kind of in a similar vein as we're talking about different alternative devices, there's a question, when you're talking about mouse users, are you also including people who use a mouse, they move with their eyes?
Yeah, yeah, that can be. Although I would say that that's probably more of a similar interaction, or kind of maybe more similar to keyboard focus, because you get that's is more akin to that experience, I would say, because you're not going to have potentially tremors and things like that. So that kind of, how can I say it? That paradigm is more married to using a keyboard.
Great. Next question. So there was a question in chat about Hover. The question is basically, do you have any examples of good experiences for Hover?
Yeah, I mean, the menu that I showed you on the cooking website, let me just, oops, you go back here. Where is it? Let me go this way. So the menu, there's a mega menu I showed you on the cooking website, where when you mouse over it, you get a really large, so we're just tabbing through on the video now, but when you mouse over it, you get a really large drop down space area. So if you look at this, so if I mouse over the main menu and I have this lovely large area where I can interact with and I can get to the content that I want without the menu disappearing. But then if we look at the previous menu, or the one that followed it on the festival website, this one, where we've got a really small area for the drop down, for the mega menu that pops out, that's a harder experience. That's a more difficult experience because the actual scope, the area, the touch target area is significantly smaller than the larger area that we saw in the cooking area, in the cooking website. So that would be a good example. And actually, I think mega menus, things like that we use for main navigation, are a really great case study, because again, we focus on keyboard accessibility. We focus on making sure that everything is announced correctly for a screen reader, as we should, but we don't talk enough about, do we have a large enough touch target zone? Does the menu stay visible until you move focus away? Does the mouse user have a choice about whether they can close it, or does it close automatically? That's all really important UX decisions that need to be taken during the design phase.
Okay, excellent. Another question, what are some of the best practices to keep in mind while implementing mouse actions on mobile devices? Things like hover do not apply, what can be used instead?
Well, yeah, that's a very good one. Well done for pointing that out. Yeah, you don't really want to be designing priority content, prime content on hover for mobile devices. So I would definitely avoid that completely. Again, touch target size, equally as important on desktop as it is on mobile. I mean, it's touch, after all, touch target, but it equates to both platforms. So just the same rules really do apply. I think mega menus are an interesting one. I mean, with responsive design, we don't really have those so much now, but be careful about content that takes over the whole screen and you can't get rid of it easily, or you can't find a close button. Things like that are really important. But yeah, going back through this presentation, touch target size, not including priority content on hover is pretty fundamental.
There are a couple of follow-up questions on mega menu. One, just a quick one. Question was, so mega menu should appear on hover and focus state?
That really depends. That's a whole different question. What I'm looking at here is sort of what happens when you get to it. It really depends on the context, I would say, of the website and what you've got in it. There will also be preferences as well, because some people, you don't necessarily always want to have things appear as your mouse glides over a link. But then you could potentially have content appear when you select that link, and then it drops down. But that's the sort of thing that I would look at within the context of the website and what's happening there.
There's another one that's kind of related to that hover, or that mega menu as well, I should say. The question is, first, you mentioned the keyboard and mouse experience should be the same. On the cooking website, would you then expect to see the green outline on hover and then the mega menu on click instead to match the keyboard experience?
I would want it to be the same, yeah. I think, I mean, this is not a rule. It's certainly something that I prefer it to see visually, but I think it's quite important to have a consistent experience as far as you can, for whether you're using your mouse or whether you're using your keyboard. Now, notice there, I'm not saying whether you are a mouse user or a keyboard user, whether you're using your mouse or your keyboard, because lots of people interchangeably use both, right? So if you have a slightly different visual experience when you're using your keyboard to when you're using your mouse, you automatically think that the website is doing something different, but it's confusing because you're actually interacting with the same feature, the same navigation. So this goes back to consistency. So making sure that you have a consistent design, a consistent experience, so that people who are both mouse and keyboard users don't get confused by things. So I would, again, and going back to the mega menu question of whether it should always open on hover or if it should open when you click on it, etc. It all goes back into considerations around that and thinking about the context of use. What I will say is, and this is perhaps an annoyance of mine, is I don't like it when I see websites which have beautifully styled hover states. So it's lovely and obvious when you mouse over something, and then they use the browser default keyboard outline, because that is confusing. Equally, for somebody who is using their keyboard at that point of time, when you see that browser default outline, it kind of makes you think like you're an afterthought, that you haven't been considered during the design process, and that sort of doesn't give you a good feeling, really. So I would always have a beautifully designed hover and focus state for interactive elements, and I would make them the same. You don't have to design something different, make them the same.
Reaching that point where you probably have more good questions than time to answer them, unfortunately. There were a couple of questions that were in the similar vein of additional resources. So for example, one person asked where they could find James Williamson's writings.
Yes, I will. I'm going to post that. Literally, I'll come off the call and I'll post those straight away.
Okay. And we are, and I'll mention this in more detail in a second, but since we do have a break coming up between the next two sessions, that might give you some time as well, Henny. If you find that, you can put that in chat. We will keep this open during the break so people can find that there. Another question about resources related to, I guess, the literature on the subject of screen readers that use mouse and magnification. I mean, any resources recommended on that topic?
Screen readers that use mouse and magnification. Well, people who use, for example, Zoom Text, which has a screen reader built in and is screen magnification, there will be people who use a combination of both. So there are people who use screen readers and will use a mouse as well. But I think the people who will exclusively not use a mouse are people who have no useful sight. So, but yeah, Zoom Text users will use it. And we've got a blog post. We've got the browsing with assistive technologies. There is browsing with screen magnification, which talks a little bit about how, as a screen magnification user, you can use a combination of screen reader and Zoom and your mouse.
I did throw that link into the Q&A panel, but in chat, I'll put where you can find all those posts. There's another question, kind of similar one, about additional resources. A resource for interaction designers where they can review patterns or techniques to overcome accessibility challenges. Any recommendations on a resource?
For designers?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would go back to the ARIA authoring practices, which is the APG, Way ARIA authoring practices guide. I can never say it. I just want to say Arthur.
I'll throw that in chat as well.
Now, this is a resource which is, it's kind of more aimed at developers, but every designer I work with, I introduce them to this resource because it talks about common interactions on the web, tab panels, accordions, things like that. It talks about what the expected keyboard behavior is and what the screen reader output is. So it is focused on that technical accessibility and less on design, but I do think it's a good place to start. In terms of mouse interaction resources, let me have a little think about that, and I'll see what I can tweet out. But after this, I will send out a whole bunch of links. So if you follow me at iHenny, I will do that there, and I'll use the WebAIM hashtag as well.
Great. The questions are just starting to flood in. I can go through these. Henny, you're welcome to open Q&A if any jump out to you as well. Let me. One question was, designers, in my experience, in SaaS product industry, go for sizzle versus sizzle visuals and complex components over designing for everyone in an accessible way. How should we encourage designers to produce designs that don't only consider the visual nature of the app?
Sit them in front of people with disabilities using their content. That is very compelling, I have to say. I mean, if you are working with a designer or a team who are of that mindset, I think there's a degree of diplomacy that goes into your conversations with people, and it's a slow burn. It's not ideal, but sometimes you might need to flag how people with temporary or situational disabilities, or impairments, I should say, experience their content. So if they're not interested in permanent disability, and they argue that it's, you know, a small amount of the population, you can say, well, let's think about people who are on a mobile device, people who are accessing content on a busy train, people who are in a rush, who might not be able to understand this interaction, etc., or animation, lots of bandwidth. That's sometimes that's a way of going in and helping to convince people, and sometimes that is potentially more relatable for some people. I would also argue that coming up with good, inclusive, accessible design is innovative in and of itself, and something to be proud of, and something that is a good challenge for designers as well. But yeah, it's don't go in and push too hard, just be really gentle, work with the designers, try and understand their viewpoint and where they're coming from and what their motivations are, and then gently introduce the benefits of designing with accessibility in mind, and just how broad it is for usability as well as accessibility.
Great. So we do have one question. What considerations should we be mindful of when using drag and drop with regards to test assessments?
So you mean in an online learning environment, potentially? I think you probably need to, and this is a tricky one, I do understand, you really need to be thinking of an alternative. It's one of the few things where I really do think an alternative is key. An alternative means to complete the action. So let's say you have to reorder 5 things, and you can drag and drop. Think about having an input field where you can put in, you know, the numbers in the order that you want for each of those 5 things, and then hit a submit or hit a reorder button and do it that way. It's tricky in a test environment because you need to make sure that the alternative is not going to take significantly longer than the drag and drop. So there's a little bit of thought that needs to go into that. But my strong feeling is that you should provide an alternative. Dragging and dropping, however accessible you make it, is never going to be usable for everybody.
Maybe time for maybe one last question. One question was, what tools do you recommend for test design to test design for accessibility?
Test designs for accessibility. It depends where you're testing, really. If you're testing in the browser, then there's plenty of tools that will give you some indication of how accessible the actual design is. WebAIM has Wave, for example, which will tell you whether your heading levels are in a logical order, or your color contrast is good, focus order, etc. But typically as a designer, you'll be working in something like Figma or Sketch. There are a few plugins that you can use in Figma, Sketch, and other things. So Get Stark is a good one. DQ has a plugin as well that works with Figma. There are a few other plugins knocking around. Figma also has just released the support for prototyping for a screen reader within Figma. I haven't used it yet, so I can't speak to how usable it is. I would say that of the tools that I've used for testing within programs like Figma and Sketch, they are useful, but they're certainly not as extensive as browser-based testing tools. And as we know, browser-based testing tools can only test so much. Tools that you absolutely must be using whenever you're designing would be color contrast checking tools. So again, Wave from WebAIM has it inbuilt, DQs has it inbuilt. There's also the color contrast analyzer from TPGI, which is a downloadable one, so you can use it across any program. That's really good to use as well. So there's testing tools, but I think it's more than just testing tools. Really, as a designer, I would probably be, and this is what I do with teams that I work with, is we have a list of checks that need to be done before the designs are handed over to developers, or before they're handed over to write the developer requirements, I should say. So it's a subset of WCAG and perhaps some other things. So check color contrast, have I got visible focus states and hover states, etc. So I would have a checklist, and there's I would also annotate those designs to make sure that you communicate the accessibility to a developer as well.
Thank you. And we had so many good questions. We didn't have time to answer all of them. We do appreciate all the great questions. Henny, thank you so much for your time.